So welcome to this afternoon's event. We're pleased to extend a courteous welcome to David Miliband MP, who is currently touring British universities to meet with students and staff. I'm Professor Judith Burnett and Dean of the School of Law, Social Sciences and Communications, which, as some of you at least will know, is a large and vibrant school where we seek to provide opportunities to students to develop a critical insight into the world in which we live. On behalf of the University of Wolverhampton, I'm also pleased to welcome you all here. This isn't just an event for our school, obviously it's an event for the wider community as well. Just to introduce David Miliband, David was elected to Parliament in 2001 as MP for South Shields. He spent a year as a backbench MP and in 2002 was appointed Schools Minister, where he led the programme Building Schools for the Future. This was, as some of you know, an attempt to rebuild and refurbish secondary schools all over the country. He also introduced a new teaching assistance scheme to classrooms during that time. In 2004, he was appointed as Cabinet Office Minister and initially was Minister of State for Communities and Local Government. Here, his contribution included the concept of city regions, which was aimed at boosting regeneration, which, as we know well here in Wolverhampton and the Black Country, is an important and high priority area. In 2006, David became Secretary of State for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, and this enabled him to provide leadership around the climate change bill. In 2007, with rapid promotion, David moved on to hold one of the greatest offices of state as Foreign Secretary. He was the youngest post holder for 30 years and oversaw a challenging period which involved him taking positions on a wide range of issues, including different theatres of war, situations of conflict and regime change, human rights struggles, issues around international relations, and perhaps controversially, the use of the military. After Labour lost the 2010 general election and Gordon Brown resigned, David stood as a candidate for the leadership of the Labour Party. In October 2010, David stood down from frontline politics and serves his constituencies in South Shields as an MP. This afternoon's event will start with David in conversation with Dr. Keith Gildart, who is also here. Dr. Keith Gildart is a reader in Labour and Social History in the Department of History, Politics and War Studies. He holds degrees from the University of Manchester and York and has published numerous books and articles on the history of the Labour movement. His books include North Wales Miners, A Fragile Unity, 1945 to 1996, and Industrial Politics and the 1926 Miners' Lockout. He is an editor of the Dictionary of Labour Biography, for which he has contributed various entries on the leading lights and contributors to the Labour movement. Further to the conversation between David and Keith, we are then pleased to invite Dr. Andy Cooper, who will then facilitate a questions and answers session in which you will have every opportunity to participate. So we'll have a first part of the debate in which Keith and David will open up various issues of interest to them, and then we open out with roving mics where you can then ask questions and debate some of the issues that have been raised. I'm sure that we're all looking forwards to it. It should be a lively debate, and I'm sure that we think it is an interesting time in which to invite someone such as David here. Our interesting times include some major challenges, including the rise of subprime capitalism and the so-called banking crisis, the continuance of theatres of war and considerable struggles around power and the redistribution of resources. We see the Eurozone trembling, apparently, and some major challenges here in the UK to the model of welfare capitalism, which provided the NHS and the education system for over 50 years. What we do see is that the world of politics and the study of politics is as alive today as it ever was, far from dying out with the rise of a consumer society and the production of a general surplus. We may instead see a new wave where all things become political. Therefore, it gives me great pleasure this afternoon to now hand over to David and Keith for the first part of this afternoon's session. Thank you.
Okay, thanks Judith, and welcome again David. What I would like to do in the time that we have allotted is to ask you some general questions on foreign policy and then a few questions on the domestic situation in the UK. And I guess the first one, which is topical in regards to my students and what they're studying here, and also to the general audience, is a question on intervention and non-intervention in terms of foreign policy. And do you think that the coalition government and the previous Labour government got the balance right between intervention and non-intervention? And I'm thinking here in the context of Iraq, Afghanistan, and recently Libya.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me, and thanks to all of you for coming along for what I hope is going to be a lively session. I think that the central feature of the modern world is that we are interdependent. We're interdependent in a way that has never been before. We're interdependent economically. We're interdependent ecologically, in other words, to do with the environment. We're interdependent on things like health. If you think about the way that SARS disease was the danger of being transferred around the world, public health in this country depends on good public health elsewhere. And we're interdependent in security terms as well. Now, in that world, I don't think intervention is an option, whether or not to intervene. We have to intervene. The question is, how do you understand your rights and responsibilities in respect of others who live far away? And there are two dimensions to that. One, what are our rights and responsibilities in respect of the abuse of rights in other countries? Tomorrow I'm giving a speech at the annual fundraising lunch of the Anne Frank Trust. Anne Frank was the young Dutch girl who wrote a diary and before she was carted off to concentration camp and killed in the Second World War, young Jewish girl. And the tragedy of the 1930s was of how little intervention there was. After the Second World War, we had the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which said there are human rights around the world and they need to be upheld, but it didn't say who would uphold them. And so the first thing I think to think about intervention is, at what stage does the abuse of someone else's rights require you to do things? To send them aid, to try and persuade the government concerned that they should do things differently, to put pressure on the neighbours of the other government, to put pressure on them to do things differently, and ultimately, does the international community have a right to intervene militarily? Point one. Point two, if someone attacks you, do you have a right to attack them? And I think that international law has historically said yes, they do. But what happens if you're attacked not by another state, but by a non-state actor, Al-Qaeda of 9/11, which is hosted by another state? Now, I would argue that if you're attacked by a non-state actor that's being hosted by another state, you have a responsibility to do something about it. And any government that said, well, we're just going to turn the other cheek would be taken to the cleaners. I think the real challenge, though, even where you have a military right, is how you build peace, not how do you wage war. Because the truth about the Afghan war and the truth about the Iraq war is that winning the war wasn't the difficult bit. In both those conflicts, the war was won pretty quickly because of the overwhelming military superiority. What the failure in both cases was to win the peace. And that is a political exercise, not a military exercise. And so what I'd say to you, and especially those of you who are studying war studies, is that you can't talk about war unless you're able to talk about peace, and you can't talk about the military unless you're able to talk about politics as well. And one of the great lessons of the last 10 years has been that unless you build political settlements, then violence returns. And that's the danger in Iraq, and it's the continuing tragedy in Afghanistan.